In this news roundup of a week for 18th of November 2022. China dominates the world stage at the G20 summit. Western countries start dialing back their hostility to it. Ukraine's power grid is seriously knocked out by Russian attack as the United Nations criticises it for human rights abuses. Donald Trump announces that he is candidate for president, but his strategy is already a defensive one. And in this week's Short Thought, I talk to you about why you should expect and welcome chaos. You might say it's a sentiment for our times. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Generally, pre-pandemic anyway, G20 or similar summits would be relatively minor affairs. Leaders speak to leaders, some big topics would be pronounced upon, some spats would be gossiped about. The stuff of day-to-day geopolitics, not necessarily something I would cover here. This time, with the Ukraine war and with various nations recalibrating how they would relate to Xi Jinping in the shadow of that war, well, it was an important and an instructive event. The headline seems to be that various leaders see an imperative in dialing back the tension with China, while still treating it with serious caution, as a dog that might still bite. This makes sense from one perspective. The West is in a difficult and costly conflict with Russia. Now is not the time you go picking fights with the larger and the better resourced rival. Also, since China's witnessing writ large the costs of Russia's military adventurism, now would be a good time to give it an alternative mode in which to pursue its competitive advantage in the world. And that was clearly the aim of Biden's significantly long summit with the Chinese premier. Following a period where relations between the US and China has been as bad as it's ever been in recent history, with both sides insulting and talking past each other, there seemed to be the emerging of a new interest in establishing peace. An uneasy peace for sure, but peace nonetheless. Bear in mind, thanks to COVID and the fact Xi Jinping didn't leave his country at all during the worst of that, this is actually the first face-to-face meeting between the two of them while they have been leaders. And it ended with a number of takeaways. First, that there should be a resumption of more effective high-level communication between the countries, some of which was frozen following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Second, that each side understands the other's red lines where they're not prepared to give ground. We can note that for both sides, Taiwan appears on that list. The third was that for the first time, Xi included the US and NATO in his call for direct dialogue with Russia to encourage de-escalation. Previously, it had just been China and the EU. Xi gave Biden an unambiguous commitment that China would oppose the deployment of any nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Biden stated that his administration did not view China and America as being in a new Cold War. This mood music was important because this was the first such discussion after Xi Jinping succeeded in becoming leader for life with a top-level team very solidly in his orbit. He has never been so strong. So it was uncertain how that might change his positioning. And also because of how the Ukraine war is playing out and the fact that Russia has been visibly losing ground. Beijing is not prepared to abandon its supportive relationship with Russia entirely. It still sees it as an important part of the much desired multipolar world that it wants to create. But China's activity at the summit underpins Xi's interest in repairing relations with the European Union and the United States. Having stared in the face the implications of being cut off from global supply chains, technology and innovation, it's a zero-sum future that clearly doesn't suit him, in the short term at least, to pursue. And this was seen before the G20 with the recent visit of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to China, and at the G20 as well. You can see China very shrewdly following its historical playbook of encouraging division amongst the forces that are facing it. It does this by courting certain specific countries, setting their interests against, for instance, the EU as a whole. France's President Macron got a summit, as did Spain's Pedro Sanchez, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, Netherlands' Mark Rutte, but the EU heads, Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, and Michel had been expected to get a summit meeting, they did not in the end get Xi Jinping's time. And only last week, China cancelled a pre-recorded speech by Charles Michel that had been due to be aired at a high-level trade expo in Shanghai. China is not remotely happy that the EU has determined that China is to be counted as a, quote, systemic rival. So the meeting with Rutte focused on the fact that his country houses the microchip maker ASML. China hoped the company would not be joining any trade coalition trying to shut China out of new technologies. For Spain, it was about boosting China's feed into Spain's tourism industry, particularly to prepare for the China-Spain Year of Culture and Tourism. For France, Macron was keen to get business cooperation on aviation and the civil nuclear power sector. For Italy, Beijing would seek to import more high-quality goods from Italy and would cooperate with manufacturing, energy and aerospace. No hint of systemic rivalry in any of those discussions. And if the EU heads do not have the backing of France, Germany, Netherlands, Spain and Italy for their political positioning, what do they have? And the answer is not enough to merit taking up Xi Jinping's time. Interestingly, and not much reported at all by the mainstream media, is that Xi did make time to meet with Senegal's president, who was in attendance on behalf of the African Union. The meeting underlined that China still places great strategic importance in building its economic presence and its relationships with many African nations, as the West tends to ignore and downplay them. After a period when it was perceived that China was maybe cutting some of its funding to the developing world, President Xi recommitted to supporting Senegal in the building of infrastructure such as roads. And he said this: China will continue to follow the principle of sincerity, real results, amity and good faith, and the principle of pursuing the greater good and shared interests and enhanced solidarity and cooperation with Senegal and other African countries to jointly build a China-Africa community with a shared future in the new era. The new era, remember? In the event of future conflict, don't be especially surprised if the African nations tend to line up at the UN in support of China. Alliances are being forged. The UK Prime Minister, meanwhile, saw his meeting with President Xi cancelled. The initial story was that this was because of the rescheduling issues caused by the missiles that landed in Poland, although it was later suggested in Chinese state media that this was because of Britain's negative attitude to China in recent years. Ironically, Sunak was being criticised by China hawks at home for apparently being ready to soften his position in the name of creating dialogue. Not soft enough, apparently, particularly when it came to suggestions that Britain would arm Taiwan in a future war with China. So that was what was said. We don't quite know the truth of it. We do know that Canada got a kicking for leaking the substance of its discussions to the Canadian press. In sight of camera, Xi Jinping gave Justin Trudeau a firm rebuke for bad faith. The other thing that was noteworthy about the summit, exactly, of course, was the fact that a missile landed in Poland during it. I don't think it ever crossed my mind as an observer that this would have been a deliberate act by Russia against NATO, because it would have been strategically bizarre to do such a thing at this time and in that way. It was always likely that it was a missile gone astray. Whether it was a Russian missile or a Ukrainian one was pretty much irrelevant. But if you're in charge of NATO and the Western countries that make it up, of course, you can take none of that for granted. And that was what the assembled leaders did and clearly desired to do, was to demonstrate how seriously it would be taken if such an attack was actually launched against a NATO member, to seek to convey to Moscow how big a line that would be to cross. Which they did. I don't imagine Moscow was entertaining such an attack anytime soon anyway, so it's perhaps incidental. Interestingly, the NATO allies concluded that the missile had gone astray from Ukrainian anti-missile defences, responding to a barrage of missiles being launched against civilian targets in the last couple of days. It had likely malfunctioned. Such missiles are meant to self-destruct if they miss their target. But President Zelensky insisted this was not the case. Biden and others simply said that he's wrong, so the puzzle remains. And it's not the only reason why Ukraine has come under some marginally critical commentary. The United Nations has said that there is evidence that prisoners held by both sides in the conflict have been subjected to torture or worse. Now, under international law, there is an absolute prohibition on torture and the ill treatment of prisoners of war. But while Russia's ill treatment of Ukrainian prisoners is more systematic, with beatings, electric shock, sexual assault being routinely administered, nevertheless, Ukraine also failed to meet the standard. The UN Rights Monitoring Mission said it had interviewed 159 prisoners of war held by Russia, 175 held by Ukraine. Ukraine gave access to current prisoners in detention, Russia didn't. So interviews could only take place with prisoners after their release. The vast majority of prisoners held by Russia reported torture. The UN said there were, however, credible allegations against Ukraine of summary executions of Russian prisoners, amongst other abuses. After the elation of the taking of Kherson last week, the allegations have been just one more element of a more difficult week. The barrage of Russian firepower against Ukraine's energy grid has started to seriously degrade its ability to operate, just as winter's really biting. And Russian offensive operations have gained strength in eastern Ukraine, notably supported by troops redeployed from Kherson. Chinese President Xi Jinping, having had all those leaders paying court to him, will have been feeling newly empowered on the international stage and happy not to have Putin's problems. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have problems of his own. The strains that have been showing around his insistence on zero COVID policies were not enough to prevent him from cementing his power, but they are still there and apparently getting worse. The repeated lockdowns have been taking a heavy toll on the Chinese economy, but also on its own people. On the one hand, when lockdowns were imposed in the Hebei provincial capital Shijiazhuang, migrant workers revolted against the measure, removing barriers, clashing directly with police. On the other side, though, when authorities began to lift that lockdown, even though there were still some cases being recorded daily, so the policy was being relaxed de facto, at least a little, people were now so scared of COVID, many of them resisted being allowed out at all. A phenomenon that some of us will recognise. Reportedly, parents came up with all sorts of excuses and imagined ailments to keep their children from going back to school, resulting in at least one kindergarten class where just one child was present on the Monday morning. The Times of London quoted Zhangzhong Huang, a Chinese public health expert based in New York, who said this: "In Guangzhou, you see opponents of zero COVID emboldened by the recent small changes, while many other people are still very fearful of the virus." It's a mess that Xi Jinping bears personal responsibility for, since the insistence on maintaining zero COVID with all the consequences that follow was his own and persistent position. Right now, the word is that the government wants to maintain zero COVID, but he wants to make it more effective by being more targeted. That seems unlikely to succeed based on the rest of the world's experience with the virus. Now, look, given the lower number of deaths associated with the dominant Omicron strains, at least some point someone has to start making the calculation that government policies are causing worse problems than the disease itself. None of this is a surprise, of course. We've seen all of the indicators of how this was going for some time. However, perhaps the leading contender for least surprising news of the week was the announcement by Donald Trump that he would be standing for election in 2024. It was a politically unusual timing, a full 2 years before the election and before the runoff election in Georgia. Trump was being urged heavily by some in his own party to delay any announcement, at least until after that vote, but most of those doing so would have recognised he would do what he wanted to anyway. So it's an unconventional strategic step. What does it tell us about the strategy that Trump is following? It seems to be twofold. On the one hand, the early announcement is probably intended to put pressure on other would-be candidates not to stand at all, to seek to gain momentum and profile for the Trump bid, to leave them with very little space left to fill. Secondly, Trump has clearly indicated that he wants to be seen as the sort of maverick outsider again that he was in 2016. The Washington outsider who was coming in to drain the swamp. It's not easy to be a second-time outsider, having been president once already, but standing when the party establishment is urging him not to. I guess that would add to the impression. Declaring early also puts pressure on those who are moving against him in terms of legal procedures. Building a possible court case against an active presidential candidate puts Biden's DOJ into a difficult position. It enables Trump to paint the legal moves as being about stopping his political challenge to the administration rather than being about actual legal breaches. The question is whether such a strategy can work for him. One should beware of jumping straight to conclusions that it can't. After all, for any conventional candidate, his campaign in 2016 and the various things that jumped up to try to derail it would have guaranteed failure. And yet he turned it into success. And there was evidence that at least some aspects of political reality were feeding into Trump's strategy based on his declaration speech. He spent more of its time attacking Joe Biden's record as president, contrasting the state of America today to how it was during his administration, and importantly, he didn't bang on about the 2020 election being stolen. If he does end up as the candidate, focusing on the future agenda, making the election about Biden and the Democrats rather than about Donald Trump, that is his likely winning pitch. And if he's going to spend the next 8 to 12 months as the only declared candidate, which is quite likely, he should probably be spending his time making himself a highly visible face of opposition to Biden, not spending his time attacking potential rivals in his own party who aren't even standing yet. That said, the odds are against him. Following how the midterms played out, he has launched his campaign at the point where he's at his political weakest. Rather than establishing momentum, there's the danger it could do the exact opposite. There have been, for instance, a number of big donors saying that they supported Trump in the past, but they will not be supporting him this time. Not only that, but his performance in the declaration speech itself was a long way from his bombastic best. It was described by commentators on both the left and the right as boring, uninspired, and listless. His performances have often been attacked for being shocking, bad-tempered, hubristic, and, in the eyes of some, dangerous. Boring is a new one, and a possible indicator into his own conflicted state of mind. It gave an opportunity for Jeb Bush, who had been famously sunk in 2016, having been labelled as low-energy Jeb by Trump, who was able to tweet this: "Wow! What a low-energy speech by the Donald. Time for new leaders. #weak. #sleepy Donny." I think he's allowed his moment of revenge. And some of Trump's campaign promises this time seemed somewhat less engaging for his base than you would have expected. So in 2016, we had build the wall to keep out the hordes of immigrants who were pouring into the country. Whatever you do or don't think about that, it was an issue that people cared passionately about. But with this launch, he was promising to plant the US flag on Mars, build a defence shield against nuclear weapons, which, I don't disagree with either of those in principle, but is that the cause that makes the MAGA hat-wearing fans excited that Trump is standing up for them against the Washington swamp? Of course, he referenced other issues. When he stood in 2016, though, he apparently knew how to frame his key issues in the way that they were the ones that drew all the attention and would outrage his opponents and excite his base. Maybe that will come later. Maybe it should come later. But to say the least, it didn't seem to be present here. But most importantly, can he really follow a disciplined campaign strategy without engaging his well-demonstrated talent for self-sabotage? The danger for him is that over the course of the next year, people just get tired of all the noise, the drama, and the rest of it. The danger is that he can't keep himself to key moments where he could make a really effective and telling attack. Instead, he'll be all over every issue, every day. That ultimately, when the focus of attention should be Biden and the various failures that will come, as they do for any administration, he will default to always wanting the focus of attention to be on himself. And he knows how to achieve that. And that's what will leave people exhausted by the end of the process. And in the meantime, Ron DeSantis has a platform as Florida governor for the occasional practical challenge to Biden, as he's done with flying immigrants to iconic, wealthy, Democrat-supporting parts of the country. he can keep his powder dry while driving home every day, but he's actually governing effectively and providing opposition, but without being in your face the whole time. That is the pitch that seems to be currently attractive to the would-be donors. So, for instance, former Trump funder and ally Steven Schwartzman, private equity firm Blackstone, who donated $35 million to the Republican candidates in the recent midterms. He said this: America does better when its leaders are rooted in today and tomorrow, not today and yesterday. It's time for the Republican Party to turn to a new generation of leaders, and I intend to support one of them in the presidential primaries. Then there was billionaire financier Ken Griffin, who gave $68 million to the party in the midterms, and he said Trump had become a serial loser, so it was time to move on. Ouch! That is the sort of label that Trump will be seeking to avoid having stick to him over the coming months. Now, I mean, maybe having people saying such things helps to cement his status as the underdog, but 2024 is not 2016, when he really was a challenger with 0 elections on his track record. And of course, there's a lot of time to come. Rivals can stumble, he could stumble, he can get lucky, others can get lucky. He may well be boosted by the mainstream media and by Democrats who, as they did with Trumpist candidates in the midterms, seem to have now calculated that Trump is more beatable in 2024 than would be DeSantis, for instance. Having seen such tricks work for them in the last election, we might well see a repeat, and maybe they'll boost him and end up living to regret it. I mean, we've seen that before.
He is again considering a run in 2016.
Do it. Do it. Look at me. Do it. I will personally write you a campaign check now on behalf of this country, which does not want you to be president, but which badly wants you to run.
Be careful what you wish for, seems to be the lesson. The majority of people just want things to be stable and relatively safe. They imagine that the world should be able to provide a neutral canvas on which to proactively paint your best life. They look at the chaos of the news right now, the sense that things are falling apart, there's instability, and it makes them depressed. Many of them switch off from the news altogether. We all choose how we want to view the world. That's their choice, and I get it. On a bad day, I can feel just the same. But the truth is this, that chaos is actually fascinating. How people and groups and society, how they all deal with crises and chaos is the stuff of legend, at least sometimes. If you study how people adapt, how people cope, how some of them fail to do any of those things, you will never be short of material to learn from. We don't want to celebrate people's misfortune, but we can be fascinated to see how people respond to adversity. Find it too stressful and dangerous? Well, some of that is just being alert to potential dangers, which is part of the key survival instinct. But bear in mind a couple of things. 1, we have seen huge tragedies in human history. 2 world wars, for instance. The vast majority of humans alive at the time of those events survived them. The majority were relatively untouched by them. All the heroic triumphs of culture and achievement through history, all of them were achieved against a backdrop of uncertain times. It's only recently we started to fancy that maybe we'd grown beyond that. Secondly, if you look at successful people in business, amongst other fields, they often have strategies for how they succeed during bad times, and they are not the same strategies of how you do it in good times. The point is that when societies are under stress, people tend to value certain things more highly, they tend to behave in certain predictable ways. If you can learn and understand the lessons from history about how these times play out, you can identify which strategies enabled people to succeed in those times. Investors like Warren Buffett built their success on such principles. He would say, be brave when others are fearful. That was how you could get the best investments. But then similarly, be fearful when others are brave. Don't jump on the bandwagons, in other words. Don't fall for the hubris when times are good that suggests that things will only get better and better. Which is one reason, incidentally, he didn't buy into crypto. In spite of the period when there seemed to be only upward spiralling returns, lots of people saying it could just get better and better. And don't think this is a recipe for selfish individualism. thriving at other people's expense. A community under stress can be an opportunity for a well mentally prepared person to step forward and provide leadership, for you to thrive by supplying the things that will help your community to get through those times. It's down to you to define the types of opportunities you're looking for. That's something that comes from the values you have as a person. You just want to bear in mind that the nature of the game is a reactive one, and it's one that you can be prepared for. All right, my thanks as always to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. They provide questions for the Q&A videos, another one of which was released on Wednesday this week. Check that out if you haven't seen it yet. And of course, without their support, I could not spend the time that I do making these videos. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.